Good evening. You're watching or listening to Redwood Wonk. I'm with David Frank. My name is Eric Kirk. We are talking national news of the day, national political news of the day. There's all kinds of national news, and we had to really choose it. It was actually kind of slow for a while, but we had to come down to three topics. We're going to start with no Justins, no peace. Justin Jones and Justin Pearson are back in the legislature due to a quirk in the law. We actually discussed last week the fact that two young black representatives, one from Memphis and one from Nashville, two areas that are becoming more and more progressive as time goes on, and they just can't gerrymander these people out. Staged well, they didn't stage. They joined a protest and used a bullhorn when their microphones were turned off during a recess in the state legislature. People didn't like what they and one woman, Johnson, did, and they voted. A motion was brought to expel all three of them. The woman was Representative Johnson narrowly escaped it by one vote, but the two young black men had been kicked out of the legislature officially after some long, very interesting debates, some very articulate speeches from the men who have now established themselves as national leaders. I can almost guarantee that they will both have speaking spots at the Democratic convention. They are now national names. And on top of it, the quirk in the Tennessee state law is that they are not barred once they're expelled. They're not barred from returning from anytime soon. And the way it works in Tennessee is that if somebody leaves office for any reason, there is a local commission. I'm not sure what other powers the commission has, but they have somewhere between 30 and 40 people in each district. They are allowed to replace anybody who leaves office. Well, there's nothing to prevent them from voting to replace the people, to send the people right back, to reappoint them, and that's what they did. Justin Jones and Justin Pearson were both sent back to the legislature by unanimous decision. I think 38-0 in one, 36-0 in Memphis, and as soon as Justin Jones got back, first thing he did was call for the speaker's resignation. I mean, he's not backing down. They are back in the legislature. This is, of course, a heavily dominated by Republicans, a supermajority they have, which was what allowed them to even do this in the first place, along with shutting down debate and just shutting down everything, according to the Democrats, in very undemocratic manner, small d Democratic. And so they're back in there. They do still have to face a special election later in the year. I'll just give since I've got other possibilities for predictions, I'm going to say that both of them are going to win easily, even if there is any opposition. There may not even be any opposition. So until the legislature changes the rules, these guys are right back in there and right back in the faces of the people who kicked them out. Dave?
Yeah, so thank you again, as always, for framing the issue for us here. So really, I think the two things we have to talk about, kind of the appearances of the expulsion in light of what they were actually doing, and then the consequences. So first the appearances and implications, consequences and implications. So the expulsion in the name of decorum on the floor, I think that this is pretty clearly an illustration of an overreach by the GOP-dominated legislature.
Yep.
Because the point has been made that there have been many other contemptible behaviors by legislative members of the Tennessee legislature that have not resulted in expulsion.
Including sexual assault in one instance that they keep bringing up.
Yeah, and it's we don't need to go down this list of awful and contemptible actions, because I've not personally verified their accuracy, but I've seen it across half a dozen forums, including by the members, some other members of the legislature. So there's a lot of claims out there about things that have happened, and so that puts an air of the appearance is that these folks were targeted. And from their own mouths, from both of the Justins, Justin Jones and Justin Pearson. I think I've seen them both say, like, look, you targeted us because of our race. And then when they asked the third member, who was that white woman, who also was protesting and violating floor rules, she had said, hey, this probably happened because of, the reason I didn't get implicated and they did, probably race.
Probably my skin color. Also
color,
possibly age, she said, but yes, both of them, yeah.
Yeah. So again, this is about, what were their actual actions and what were the appearance of their actions. And so you'd say, well, why? What did they do and why were they expelled? And so there were options. They were first of all, the protest was in the legislative chamber. It was on behalf of their constituents' demands for action on gun violence. So it was an actual authentic expression of outrage and representation. It's not like they were committing crimes. It's not like they were demeaning the stature of their office. They were actually advocating on behalf of their constituents to be heard, basically. And so because the types of responses to gun violence in Tennessee that they had seen from their peers prior were basically the party line from NRA, don't do much, right? Like not
with somebody even saying there's nothing we can do.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Right. So in a way that, to a certain extent, civil disobedience is often a viable approach, and that's what their that's what their constituents were engaging in, and they were amplifying that voice. So even if you disagree with their approach, the question is, were there alternative options for other for the GOP-led legislature to express their disagreement with these actions? And my thought is, and I've heard other people say it's obviously not an original thought, was they could have censored them. And so I got the definition here of censure. Censure is a formal public group condemnation of an individual, often a group member, whose action runs counter to the group's acceptable standards for individual behavior. And that seems to fit pretty well. And so that was an option for them, but when you see what happened here, that was not the choice that was taken. The choice taken was, let's kick them out for the way they behaved, which is unprecedented. And so to me, that's why the ripple effects are felt across the entire country, because everybody's saying, look at how this is playing out. This is already a racially contentious legislative body, and actions speak louder than words here. And they didn't choose to condemn the behavior formally, like they could have through a censor, but instead it was, they're not one of us. Let's get them out. And I think that's going to lead to larger political implications, which we could pick up, after get some feedback from you on this.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing is this was an extreme measure for extreme behavior. It's only been used in Tennessee 8 times before that. One was during Reconstruction, when there was some holdover Confederates in the legislature, 6 of them, who refused to acknowledge that ex-slaves were citizens and refused to meet with any of them, and were violating process with regard to that, to completely shut it down. They were kicked out. In the 1920s, somebody was expelled because they'd been convicted of bribery. And more recently, about 20 years ago, because of sexual harassment of staff. These are extreme things. This is not something that should be politicized. And of course, to add to it, the person, I'm forgetting his name now, I don't even want to remember it, but who authored or sponsored the bill to expel them, gave a really dripping, condescending speech to him. This was a temper tantrum, and now you're learning you wanted detention, and now you've got it. Now you don't like it. I mean, it was really childish, and yet at the same time condescending to the point. And Justin, I believe Justin Jones responded, "Do you hear this? How this man just spoke to me?" This is what you're allowing here. This is, this is, and without saying racism, basically said, yeah, this is extremely condescending. He should be embarrassed. I mean, and with long pauses saying this is how I'm being treated. And the rest. And when they were asked, what did you mean by no justice, no peace? They gave the history of it, its meaning, going back to Dr. King, referring to it. It's not a call for violence. There's all kinds of different things. There's even biblical references, when that they talked about, including New Testament, where Jesus Christ says, I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. He wasn't talking literal violence. He was talking symbolically a sword that will split, divide father and son and the rest. Well, does that mean he says that the father and son should be fighting with swords? No, it's got a history, biblical and political in there. And he tried to explain that, and the white majority, Republican majority, just wasn't hearing it.
Yeah. So just to follow up on that, angle of analysis there, I have seen some commentators that were to a certain extent in defense of the Tennessee legislature's decision to expel, and their angle, much of it centered on the fact that this was comparable to the January 6th event, right. And that in some way this was an insurrection, and that in some way that there was a mob that was storming the legislative body. Yeah. But in reality, it was like occupying a lecture hall when a professor's denied tenure. You go in, you make a lot of noise, and you say your piece, and then you leave. I don't think there was any
typical civil disobedience. No destruction. Exactly. No vandalism. Exactly. No threats of violence, no Nancy, none of that. No, yeah. It was a typical civil disobedience protest, which is a bit of a culture shock to some people in Tennessee. They're not used to that happening. But deal with this is the new generation, as Ms. Johnson said, the white woman who was on their side, said this is a younger generation. They have different ways of approaching things, but as long as it's not violent, it should be accepted. If you don't like it, do your own protest, right? I mean, but this is in protest, civil disobedience in the American tradition. That's totally what this was. But Tennessee is a bit different from other states in a lot of ways. As some people point out, it's where the Klan was born. I do believe that is of significant notice. But again, these type of people were not being elected. I don't even just mean black, but very solidly left-wing, people who are willing to do this kind of a thing. It wasn't possible 20 years in even Nashville or Memphis. It was to get somebody like this elected, and now they've got to deal with two of them.
Yeah, and like you said, they were reinstated by their county commissioners, yep. And so they'll be back. They are back now formally in the chamber, and so now we're back to. And I know we still need to get to national implications here, but let's just talk about what policy area is going to be addressed. So instead of it just being, hey, we need to have a forum where we talk seriously about our common interests, because everyone's outraged about school violence and gun violence, killings, death, like the people across the spectrum. People don't want that to happen. People want common sense safety efforts to address common interests.
Yeah, just to point out really quickly, another mass shooting in the state just to the south in Kentucky yesterday. I mean, it goes on and on and on, as they say, this week's massacre. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, point well taken. So then they're back to where they were before this issue came up, and before the distraction from actually getting to the bottom of what are some common sense approaches. And I've seen, whether it's Nicholas Kristof in the New York Times pointing out that, look, if you look at the top 20 gun safety options available to us, the way they've been polling for years and years here is that they have between, depending on which one, the top one is like 90% approval on a bipartisan basis. You go all the way down, the top 10 are still like 65% approval across Republicans and Democrats. So there is a lane here to talk about at least 10 great angles for addressing, and not great, but widely popular and thoughtful ways to talk about things that could be made better. But that's not what's happening here. Is a distraction. But so now, in addition to worrying about not worrying, but in addition to addressing this the gun safety issue, now they're also addressing the democratic deficiency of how a supermajority in the legislature could push out dissenting voices, and the ripple effects of dissenting voices getting silenced on other policy issues around the country. I think will be picked up. In part, this will put wind in the sails of reformers.
Yeah, and of course, they've set an example too. I mean, they brought attention to this. I think this was a major miscalculation on the part of the Republicans, a major one that does have national implications, because it looks like they're trying to shut down dissent. It looks like they're trying to abuse government process to obtain political aims of silencing that dissent. I mean, it looks bad. And again, anytime this comes up, or anytime any protest comes up that it tries to get shut down, one of these Justins is going to be interviewed on a television show. They are now national leaders. The Republicans have turned this guy. Nobody's going to remember the name of the guy who gave the condescending speech. I don't even remember it now, and I'm a junkie on this type of stuff. I don't care. He's probably going to be out next time. Apparently, he's not in all that secure district. So there's a good chance of that. But these, of course, there's going to be debate. Well, they were in the horn with a bullhorn, interrupting the session. They actually weren't. They were on recess when it happened. I mean, it's just, there's a whole lot, but it really doesn't matter. What they've done is they've not only made these people into leaders, but they've shown that this type of protest works. Dueling abortion pill rulings. We had a ruling that essentially bans, and I am going to get the drug Mifepristone. I don't know if I'm saying that right. I've only just been reading it. That it comes from that, but their FDA approved it for basically abortion. It's more than a morning after pill, as another host on another show corrected me. It is Mifepristone. Oh, that's interesting. Anyways, it is an abortion pill that's done within the first weeks of the pregnancy. It terminates the pregnancy before it is really, in any type of advanced situation. It has been approved by the FDA more than 20 years ago. And all of a sudden, due to a lawsuit in Texas, a federal judge, somebody who was appointed by Trump, who was opposed because of partisanship heavily, and I'll let you provide the names of the judges, banned it nationally. It's a local federal case, but this judge took it upon himself to ban the drug nationally, but agreed to put a stay on it while pending appeal, so a week-long stay. Less than an hour later, I guess that somebody ran into court in Washington state. There was a conflicting judge there that ordered the federal government to protect access to the drug in 17 Democratic-led states and the District of Columbia. So basically states where I'm not quite sure exactly what the basis of that ruling is, but in 17 states now they've got conflicting rulings. What do people do? It's not really clear. They're sort of breaking a law if they do and if they don't. So my guess is that the circuit courts will deal with this in short order. But especially since there's a stay on it, so nothing's being pulled out of the stores quite yet. But this is become an issue because recently Walgreens actually stopped selling it after consumer pressure, and California is refusing to do business with Walgreens in terms of its the medication. So we've got a lot. There's a lot to discuss there. This is, of course, the latest salvo in anti-abortion politics. And again, this is not what Republican strategists want to be in the news constantly, to constantly remind people. I mean, the Republicans are worried about losing young voters due to TikTok. They've already lost some elections because of this issue. And for this judge to push this, it's undermining the Republicans in general.
Yeah, it's hard to wrap your head around the implications here because there are so many levels of it, and the ripples go far and wide. But I think we should start at the sort of the cause, the foundation here, and that is the Judge Matthew Kacsmaryk. I don't know.
Kacsmaryk, I believe.
Kacsmaryk, yes. From Texas. There you go. Sorry with my pronunciation. So Judge Kacsmaryk, in effect, people, what some legal analysts are saying and other commentators is that it's really it's taking a 19th century anti-profanity legal principle.
The Comstock Act.
Comstock. Yep, exactly. And it's projecting that onto a settled decision from 20 years ago about a drug that's considered very safe and very legal. And it's basically saying that this is a facilitator of profanity. And because of the existence of this drugs, it's undermining the moral character of the country.
Right.
And so like, firstly, the justification seems contrived at best, but more importantly, there's regulatory law, there's regulatory precedent that you have a formal period of where an FDA administrative decision could have inputs, can have appeals, but ultimately at some point these decisions become established. So not only is it kind of undermining the normal regulatory process, but then take that one step further. And what it's doing is it's undermining the potential to undermine the legitimacy of regulatory authority much more broadly, because if it's this issue in this case, but what about, say, the EPA on its decision to regulate carbon, for example? You could say, oh well, carbon doesn't fall under the purview of pollution, so therefore anything that the EPA says about carbon would be illegitimate. So you can see here that we're not just talking about the access to safe abortions, and like I said, the drug has been proven to be safe, and one commentator said it's actually safer than Viagra, for example, among other things. I don't know that to be true, but this person claimed it was. I'm not an expert here, but other drugs, of course, right? And so more than half of all abortions in the United States are medically induced abortions. So this is not some fringe detail when it comes to basically the access to safe abortions across the country, because it would, according to this judge's decision, it would then have effect nationwide, because it would say, oh, the decision of the FDA to make this accessible is no longer valid. And so that's a stretch for any federal judge in a situation similar to this. But in this case, what we've got, a complicating factor, is that in Washington State, on this, at the same time, effectively, Judge Thomas Rice, who was appointed by President Obama, granted a request, like you said, from 17 states and the District of Columbia to in effect lock in the access to the drug, and he blocked the FDA from making any changes to the availability of this drug, in effect to try to kind of, I guess, stave off the fact that this would be somehow massively change the landscape. And so the Texas judge did give 7 days for an appeal. The appeal is in place. The appellate court in Texas, you could talk more to this angle, but the appellate court in Texas, I think it's the Fifth Circuit, is considered one of the most conservative. So there is a potential for them to side with this judge, even though that's a stretch of legal principles. And then because these two federal courts are in conflict, that would then mean that the President and the White House and the Justice Department would then appeal likely to the Supreme Court. And then you and I have talked about, we could talk about a level, and then you and I could also talk about Supreme Court level. In the past, you and I have talked about how this Supreme Court seems more than willing to, I'm going to say it's flat out right, radical reinterpretation of precedent and principle. We talked about this when it came to religious school funding. We've talked about this with Dobbs. So Dobbs is not radical in the sense that it's precedent, not principle. But in any case, they have no reservations at all about drastic changes. So yeah, I'll toss over to you and sort of get you some feedback.
Well, first of all, the Comstock Act was a very interesting act passed in 1873. It was actually principally intended to prevent the mailing. It's focused on mailing, stuff that you can mail and can't mail. So you can probably, in theory, stock it in stores, but you got to send it by UPS unless that's considered mail. I don't know. But it was focused on pornography, on stuff that was lewd and the rest. But it threw in that you also can't mail contraception and or any instruments used for abortion. This is before abortion politics became a thing. The last time I'm aware of that the Comstock law was raised was when federal authorities tried to stop City Lights bookstore in San Francisco from distributing Allen Ginsberg's poem Howl as obscenity. And that led to a big trial. Unfortunately, that law that didn't overturn the Comstock Act as a violation of the 14th Amendment, possibly even the 10th Amendment or anything like that. It didn't get that far because it was able to rule because they brought in all kinds of experts to argue that howl did not qualify as obscenity because it had great social relevance on all sorts of different levels. Then they brought in writers and academics to do this. So that's the history of it. We really haven't seen it come up since then. It's been considered an obscure law. Why nobody in Congress has thought to try to overturn it since then, just or repeal it, I don't know. It's just one of those weird books, laws that remain on the books, like the anti-oral sex laws that have been overturned so far, might be reinstated in some southern states. It's just one of those obscure laws that just snuck back, and this guy is saying, well, it says to me that you can't send anything that allows for abortion, and it just that's what it says, and that's all I care about. And it's again one of these things that why it wasn't allowed to get this far. How was it allowed to stay on the books and not be deemed, well, even though it hasn't been enforced, it is, there will be some attention the next time the Democrats have any kind of a majority. They will repeal it in both houses. So it's a real tricky thing, but it's like nobody saw this coming. I didn't know this was still on the books. I thought Howell had sent it, into obscurity. Well, it did for a while until it came back. Very disturbing kind of situation. This was, of course, everybody assumed that it was in Texas. It had something to do with the Texas law. It had nothing to do with the Texas law. This is a federal case, and we will hear arguments. And the question is, if it gets up to the Supreme Court, what are they going to rule? Well, you've got Justice Thomas, who's very much a literalist about everything except for ethical rules, apparently, and will probably say that's what the law says, just like this judge. Roberts, will he, look more nuanced? Okay, maybe they'll get Democrats will get a fourth justice in there. Will Kavanaugh buck the anti-abortionist movement in this one? I don't know. The timing of it, it probably won't get to the Supreme Court before the end of this year, but probably by sometime next year, because I think the circuit courts, both of them, are going to probably act very quickly on this because there needs to be some resolution, and then both of those cases will probably make it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court's going to have to accept certiorari on it. There's just no way they can't, and issue some kind of ruling just in time for the 2024 election. I mean, it's just it is the Republicans are in a political bind, and if they're smart, they would overturn this law. They would work with Democrats and say Comstock Act is no longer. We are repealing this law, rewrite it, whatever. I mean, we send so much porn through the mail anyway, and now that it's online, who even cares? But it's so. They at any rate, this is the situation. It's very tricky. I have tried to find out exactly what Judge Rice based his ruling on, and most of the articles aren't really clear on it, and it's not a published opinion or anything, so it's kind of hard. But it may just be that they see it as he sees it as a federal overreach, but I've not been able to find the basis for it.
So thank you for that analysis. Also, it's targeted and timely. One of the issues that I did see raised, and I don't know if this carries over into the Washington case or not, but standing. I know there's been a lot of talk about standing. So the parties that brought the case in Texas, the question is, was there any, were they sufficiently harmed to be able to come before the bar? And it seems like, from what I've seen, that they're basically claiming that, well, if there was a patient who was given access to this drug through a doctor, and then that patient then went to another doctor, and that other doctor disagreed with the decision to give that medical referral, then that second doctor's professional advice was harmed because on behalf of the client who got the abortion pill given to them, and it just seems arcane at best. It just doesn't seem like, from what I've heard. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but it sounds from some of the analysts that I've heard that the standing isn't really very solid. And then the question of part of standing is the timeliness, and so the judge actually did ask the plaintiffs here, have you ever seen a case where a drug that was approved this long ago gets re-litigated or reassessed? And they said no. And so that probably partially explains why there's this, a massive pushback from Big Pharma. Big Pharma was basically saying, this is not how it's supposed to work. Once the FDA approves a drug 20 years ago, it's not the case that a judge should be able to sort of unilaterally undermine the safety, efficacy, and legality retroactively in such a way as this.
Yeah, no, and again, this is this goes back to the rights of people to access, and depriving in the mail should be considered a 14th Amendment violation, not to mention a violation of several other rights. It's just like, it's very similar to Griswold v. Connecticut, which the Supreme Court has not yet directly overturned, but may do so. It was a precursor to Roe v. Wade that basically said that there couldn't be a state law that barred doctors and patients from discussing contraception. That is, access was their right, the privacy rights. So basically, this is very complicated. And we'll see what happens. We'll probably be discussing this in the following weeks, because I do believe that the appellate courts are going to make quick use and get it to the Supreme Court as soon as possible. But meanwhile, everybody's confused. The Department of Justice is asking for clarification and not getting it.
I think I've made mistakes. I mean, every time somebody says I made a mistake, they do the polls and my numbers go up. So I guess I haven't made any mistakes.
We showed up and we demonstrated that we would not have our voices silenced by a Republican Party that across the country had a singular intention on suppressing the right to vote.
Some Democratic senators seem to imagine they could just break the rules on a razor-thin majority. Nothing would stand between them and their entire agenda, a new era of fast-track policymaking.
The Republican Party moved very far away from reality. And the fact that you got colleagues of mine in the Senate who refuse even today to acknowledge that Donald Trump lost the election. How do you deal with that?
Joe Biden is the president we need right now. Battle-tested, forward-looking, honest and authentic. He has never forgotten who he is fighting for.
This brings us to our final topic, the leaks of I forgot how many pages, about 100 pages or so of Pentagon records. It is all kinds of things that were very specifically pointed out. It's hard to know exactly what the agenda is of whoever did it, whoever had access to it. I don't know if they see themselves as a whistleblower, sort of like Julian Assange, or more along the lines of, is this something like the Pentagon Papers, but done by, provided by Daniel Ellsberg, which revealed secret bombings in Cambodia and the rest. But this just has, they've released information on all sorts of topics. First of all, the Pentagon has drawn conclusions that the Ukraine air defense systems are being stretched and they may run out of ammunition by this spring. The Pentagon has doubts about Ukraine's spring counteroffensive. Of course, they had doubts about the offensive on Kherson, too, so that doesn't necessarily mean anything, but it's revealed to Russian that they have, that at least in the United States estimation, this counteroffensive is probably not going to be very effective, and they may get into details of why, which could be very damaging to Ukraine. U.S. intel on Russia could now be compromised because this is likely, with the specific information, they're afraid that the Russians might be able to kind of reverse engineer it back to the sources, and that those sources probably now have to be gotten out of Russia if they can, and that's entirely destroyed. It revealed that an Israeli spy agency was supporting domestic protests here. And the like. South Korea was concerned about supplying munitions to the United States. That it revealed that they didn't trust that weapons they were giving to the United States might be sent to Ukraine against their country's policy. That Egypt secretly planned to supply Russia with rockets. I mean, it's and that the United Arab Emirates agreed to work with Russian spy agents against the United States and UK. I don't know what the agenda was of this person, but it was very specific. These topics. It wasn't just random documents like the Pentagon Papers, where they just took everything. It was very specific papers targeted. They are working hard to find out who this person was, but it's created a mess. On many different levels. It could have some impact. It undermines a lot, including the support for Ukraine, and may actually assist Russia in its fighting of Ukraine. It may also lead to some opposite stuff, such as pressure on the United States to up its supply of Ukraine's air defense system. So it's hard to know what the agenda was. Maybe somebody just did it to get off. I don't know. But it's really hard to say. Was it a left-winger? Well, I don't think very many left-wingers make it into the Pentagon. I know Barbara Ehrenreich's daughter was in there, but they watched her like a hawk. So I think if you've got any leftist tendencies, you're probably not going to be able to get away with much. Dave, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so this one, obviously, we talk about three-dimensional chess all the time, sometimes when it comes to political activities, but in this case, it's strategic and security activities. So it's in a given, I guess, to a certain extent, that you need to assess what appears on the surface, and then what the potential causes and what instigated it, not just causes, but actually what initiated the whole idea, right, of this set of documents at this time. And because two complicating factors, besides the fact that you laid out that there are a bunch of different documents with a bunch of different consequences. For example, like you said, it shows that the United States is using signals intelligence to spy on our allies' innermost, conversations. There's been some press that has come out that says, like, some of our allies are saying, look, we are an open book with the United States. There's no space between us. The fact that they spied on us, they don't say it so bluntly, but the idea that the fact that we listen to South Korea, for example, South Korea is saying, hey, look, we tell them everything anyway, so you're not gonna bother us. And I think Egypt has said the same thing, and to a certain extent, I've heard the same thing from other allies that were named in the documents. So there's that piece of it, which is just to cause, like you said, a little bit of mayhem amongst allies and adversaries alike. So when it comes to the war, that's the Ukraine War Insights. Some of that documents in there, some of the revelations have to do with the capacity. What is the capacity of Ukraine to actually accomplish what they're saying publicly, to actually push Russia physically through force, kinetic force, push them out of these areas. It seems implausible, but in part why, right? And so the reason why, what we're hearing is that there, 2 out of, I think, 9 or so of the potential brigades are fully trained. Well, how are you going to, or 8 maybe, how are you going to train another 6 brigades when they don't even have the material that they need to follow the mission that is currently, a secret hypothetical offensive? So in a way, you could say, well, on its face, this could be just a way to get this out there with the purpose of encouraging more U.S. supplies and support. So now you're thinking, well, what documents were revealed and why? But that kind of points the finger back at a U.S. leak for a U.S. agenda. In fact, it might be a U.S. leak for an anti-Ukrainian agenda, in the sense that maybe their sights are too high, and that publicly we're saying, look, you're talking about defeating making gains on the battlefield that potentially aren't fully possible under the circumstances. So in a way, it's like saying, look, we're going to reveal to the world that maybe we can't actually accomplish what we intend to accomplish. But then the question is, okay, well, what about if it's, say, Russia? Because one of the things that happened here was that one of the documents that had to do with the casualty numbers on the Ukrainian and the Russian side were actually doctored. They were so now it's not just information. There's, to a certain extent, misinformation or disinformation involved, because not only was it actual documents released, but it was doctored versions of them for someone's agenda. And so one thing I think was really important here is, like, okay, well, if it is the U.S. itself internally or a U.S. ally, where do they get access to it? So a lot of these documents actually say that it's from the Joint Chiefs bulletin, the Joint Chiefs, booklet of supporting documentation, meaning it's a very small inner circle of folks, and on the U.S. side, and then some of our highest, closest allies internationally have access to Joint Chiefs documents. And so now it's like, okay, well, it might not be a U.S. leak. It might be one of our other allies, like France just went publicly in China and hinted that, in theory, they want to stay neutral. And so now we're getting to that second level and third level. It could be our allies, but our allies wouldn't doctor the documents like this. So in a way, these documents have made their way around the mountain to some mischievous person, possibly modified by Russia. And so let me say real quick, 2 more things. One is Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin has said we are committed to getting to the bottom of this leak. So that's what we expect to see publicly, and in fact that might actually be true. Maybe they really are committed. Well, where were they found? So for folks, not to bury the lead here, but this is about the security of classified documents. Where were they found? They were on a message board, Discord, in an area where people play games online. It was in an online gaming message board, and it was a couple people who were arguing about the Ukraine war, and one person person was like, oh, I'll show you. I'm right about the Ukraine war and you're wrong. And so they posted them. And that was a month ago that they did this. So this is in some small arcane corner of the internet. Then they were later posted on 4chan, which is where like all the awful things ever get posted. 4chan is a terrible, another story. But so these documents were like out there lingering in obscure corners of the internet for a month before they made the public news cycle. And so the question is, how is this possible that they're out there? It questions the ability of the United States to keep secrets, but also now we're coming back to the fourth and fifth level analysis. Well, if the United States didn't want to plant this in the New York Times or the Washington Post and some favorable mainstream media outlet, well, maybe this was a way to kind of sort of launder the liability, launder the accountability. And so truthfully, of these 5 or 6 things we just mentioned, we might not ever know. But I think it's historic.
Yeah, I mean, and the thing is sometimes agendas are clear. I mean, Dan Ellsberg and his partner, they wanted to reveal that there were secret wars going on outside of Vietnam, that it had spread, that this was Nixon's policy, that that basically all laws were being abandoned with regard to congressional oversight and just basic process, that there is no right to be able to go into those countries, even if Viet Cong were going there. Edward Snowden had certain agendas about the military-industrial complex and the fact that there were atrocities that he revealed that had been basically held back from the public. So they're going to have a following. They have a following, mostly left. Snowden actually has a little bit of right and left support, and the rest. Julian Assange as well had sort of an agenda, the stuff that he revealed maybe not quite along this line. So the question is there going to be popular support for this person? Have they revealed anything that's outrageous about government policy or anything? And whose agenda does it serve? I noticed today, just before we came on, that Ukraine is now directly asking for F-15 and F-16 fighter jets. So far, the Poland and Slovakia have been willing to provide Ukraine with M29 fighter jets, Soviet-era ones, the ones that are in their possession. But F-16, F-15, and F-16 fighters are much more modern and would put them at par, at least, if not better, than some of the Russian jets that they're up against, although they're doing quite well. And of course, it isn't just about sending them planes. People have to be trained to fly them. It's not, so it wouldn't be something that happened right away, but that could be a turning point in the war, just as the tanks that we're sending, which are probably going to get there faster than originally believed. There's going to be pressure for this. So was somebody actually wanting to support Ukraine by doing this? You can make that argument that Ukraine is, it shows that they just don't have what they need to get the job done. So now there's going to be pressure to do that. But there's also counter pressure. What's his name in Florida? Who's the Cuban American senator in Florida? Marco Rubio saying maybe we're not going to support them anymore because Zelensky is supporting Macron and not wanting to get involved with China. So if they're not supporting us, maybe we shouldn't support them. Well, that's not going to go very far. He knows that. I think he's trying to provide cover for DeSantis, who said some dumb things a few weeks ago about Ukraine and Russia. But so was that the agenda? But that seems pretty subtle. I mean, and why all this other stuff? Again, I don't know. There's stuff in there that doesn't have anything to do with it, but it does. And revealing that Egypt and UAE, it probably does prevent them from doing that. So was this a deliberate, policy thing? It seems like a lot of stuff for a deliberate leak. But and the fact that they don't have any suspects with that, it shouldn't be that hard to track who checked these things out and brought them where. It shouldn't be that hard. But as of today, we don't have any knowledge as to who it might have been.
Yeah, well, like I had said, from my understanding is that these documents had an indicator on there that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, it was the daily Pentagon briefing to principals. So this is the highest level of secrets in effect. And so we don't know why it ended up on Discord, why it's a couple of anonymous gamers in an anonymous backwater of the internet. But I think one of the things you pointed out is it seems like an awful lot of information out there for it to have a focused agenda. But when it comes to and I hate to say this because it's one of those things where people are the fog of war. It's the fog of war, basically. I'll use that terminology, and that we have counterintelligence folks who we have counterinsurgency folks. We have psychological warfare folks. There's all sorts of people who specialize in in undermining the status quo for the purpose of shaking things up and clearing lanes of movement for highly focused agendas so that they do sort of disappear into the woodwork. So let's talk about, for example, the Nord Stream pipeline. That's a highly focused, really narrow issue, yet there's the fog of war around that too. Where it's not clear what happened, and we may never know what happened, but we certainly know that the narrative that's out there, there's a disconnect between the narrative and sort of the more rational, targeted understanding of what happened. And I think this might be similar, where the reality on the ground is a stalemate. The reality on the ground is tragic losses for both parties. The reality on the ground is that every war has always ended in either complete capitulation or diplomacy. And complete capitulation here on either side is not seemingly an option. So therefore it's going to be diplomacy, but there's no lane for diplomacy currently. So if you shake all the trees out and you see where the fruit falls, so to speak, for a terrible metaphor here, the idea is that something different has to happen. But until then, the United States is saying we're committed to doing everything possible, and that lane is left more open now since this leak than before it.
Eeny, meeny, chili beanie, the spirits are about to speak.
Are they friendly spirits?
Friendly? Just listen.
This brings us to predictions. Dave, what do you have for us?
Okay, well, this week we've been hearing outrage and criticism over ProPublica's recent revelations that Justice Clarence Thomas's failure to disclose decades worth of gifts from benefactor billionaire Harlan Crow. And I just want to point out that there's a case, I have to attribute this to the Hill Rising, Brianna Joy Gray. She pointed this out, that the Supreme Court case O'Connell versus Federal Election Commission, Justice Thomas expresses his belief that amplifying political speech through any and all spending is appropriate political persuasion, and that policy outcomes that are in alignment with unlimited spending are evidence of the success of that persuasion. And so my thought is that while Thomas's lack of disclosure is not currently a violation of Supreme Court ethical standards, the egregious nature of this practice will serve to draw attention to the actual substantive issue at hand, namely Justice Thomas's judicial philosophy that unlimited spending is legitimate and does not have a corrupting influence on the American political process. My prediction is that this is going to lead to ethical reforms and increased oversight of the Supreme Court, and moreover, history will likely judge him harshly as reflective of the corruptive principles of this neo-gilded era.
All right, well, I'm going to stay in the legal realm here. There have been some major revelations in the Dominion versus Fox News, which is set to begin next week. I believe they've actually already are going to start jury selection tomorrow. But there have been a flurry of motions, and one of them, what's been revealed is that the Fox News held back on and suppressed some discovery. There was some conversation between Giuliani and the one of the producers for Fox News. That producer is now a disgruntled ex-employee and provided them to the Dominion's attorneys, which means Fox did not produce them in discovery. When you provide discovery, you actually have to have somebody from Fox News verify that this is all of the discovery that should have been provided. Well, the judge is very angry. The judge is also very angry that he was lied to by Fox's lawyers about the role Murdoch plays in the actual running of Fox News. A whole lot happening here, but basically there's now going to be a special investigator to make sure that Fox has not suppressed even more evidence, and they're going to be heavily sanctioned. They've lost credibility with the judge. This is unethical and stupid, because you don't withhold something like that because you don't know what's going to get into the other side's hands. And once they know you're going to lie under oath, the judge knows this. This person, whoever signed that, could probably be hauled up to the trial. I am predicting that Fox News is going to lose this and is going to be hit with a very large judgment. Nothing has gone Fox's way other than the Dominion doesn't get to bring up January 6th, but that's sort of off topic anyway. I'm just looking at this case. It is a clear-cut case of malice, but Fox News is in a jam because if they settle, it shows weakness. They've lost their brand. So they can't settle. So it's a train wreck. They're going to have to write a very large check, I am predicting. And that's all for this week. Until next week, stay informed and stay engaged.